today, this is the first of two mayoral conversations with the mayoral candidates we'll be having today. This one at 10, next one will be at 3 o'clock. And it's an editorial board session. The one member up here who's not a member of the board is Fran Spielman, but we really like having Fran here because we think she knows more than most folks about these issues, and she can help us ask some questions. It is an editorial board meeting for the purposes of making a decision about an endorsement. I want to say a couple of things. One is, thanks for being really patient. This is really late in the game to be having this kind of a session. And some of your folks have been calling us over the last week saying, are you guys going to be doing this? And we were honestly waiting to see if the field could get a little smaller, right? We thought we'd get a better debate if there weren't 14 candidates. That has not happened. It's gone down just a bit. And we also thought maybe if we did a poll, which we did do, it might make it obvious that some people are serious candidates and some are not. And you know, first of all, it did not do that. Secondly, we thought the poll left out people we really respect and wanted to hear from, and we didn't want to exclude them from the debate. So we did this two-session thing. My last point about that is why this group as opposed to some other combination of candidates. Marilyn Garcia and I literally pulled your names out of a hat, and we did it on basis, with one exception. So I want to be really transparent. It was looking too white. So we flipped, just one flip between the afternoon session and the morning session, because, you know, this is Chicago. We need diversity even in our debates. And that's how we made this decision. Wanted you to know that. And then finally, what we're hoping for today is not a forum kind of thing where we just go down the line and ask you a question, you each give an answer. We're also not looking for a big brouhaha. We're looking for a really thoughtful conversation, a discussion about really important issues. So I'll start it out, and my first question will go to Bill Daley. Yeah, look at me. And
no, just
oh, by the way,
I want to bet on
I'm
that.
not going to go through that. We're also not going to do the stump speech openers. You've all done that enough. So my first question is for Bill Daley. You know, Mr. Daley, as I went through our questionnaires, among other places, it looked to me that among all the candidates, you were the most forthrightly in support of the possibility of a state constitutional amendment to change the pension benefits for current city employees as part of a plan to get a handle on our financial crisis with respect to unfunded pension liabilities. So first of all, I want to ask you, is that accurate? And after you've talked, we'd love to hear from the other folks and what they think about that. And secondly, it gets to a larger issue about the role of labor unions in Chicago and in resolving our financial problems, because as I think many of you know, the labor unions are very opposed to any changing of pension benefits, even for young new employees. And my last point about that, of course, is no secret that part of the ownership of the group, the Chicago Sun-Times, is labor unions. So that's our issue to deal with. So, Mr. Daley, would you like to respond to that?
We have 50,000 retirees of the city of Chicago and 35,000 present employees. They represent about a $28 billion obligation by the citizens of Chicago to them. I have stated repeatedly, and I said this to the CFL when I met with them, that you cannot have an honest discussion in the world we live in right now with the Constitution as it is and has been interpreted by the Supreme Court. Even small changes to pensions that Mayor Emanuel and labor leaders tried to accomplish were not approved by the court. So we are living in this box. And I've said at the same time, lots of revenue ideas I've thrown out, some which some people don't like. I've said everything ought to be on the table on that side. But if you have no means to change, and it should not, I do not believe that the progress we need to make on this issue should be on the backs of the retirees. There must be a combination of changes to the system and new revenue. You cannot have the discussion on this side of the table with the Constitution as it is and how it has been interpreted. So it's not we can't sit down with labor and have an honest negotiation on this issue in the world we live in. So we can, talk about all the revenue side, but the problem is, and the 85,000 people that I talk about, and I know many people who are on pensions, and they should not get screwed, okay? But on the other hand, you can't just do this on the backs of the taxpayers. But labor and the political system cannot come together and have an honest negotiation on these issues unless the Constitution is changed. It is impossible. And there may be fake news some places, but there's no fake math, and the math doesn't work.
So let's just get you all involved in this conversation, not just rigidly. I think one of the things to understand is I understand this now, correct me, but that retirees get a 3% increase in their pension benefits every year. And one of the arguments the mayor has made, and I
compounded.
Pardon me? Compounded, very important to say. And one of the points I think you've made and the mayor has made, current mayor, is that it would be better if the increase was simply the cost of living increase and not 3% automatically compounded. So who has a different view about why Mr. Daley is wrong? Jerry? Mr. Joyce?
The retirees held up their end of the bargain. So to go in and change the Constitution to take away a benefit that they negotiated for, they held up their end. They did what was required of them. When they agreed to work for the city, whether it be a first responder who agreed to run through a burning building or run into a shootout, they didn't say, oh, but if there's not enough money, I won't do that. They did everything that was required of them. So to change the Constitution to take that benefit away from them is not only unjust, it's morally reprehensible, and it's not something that we need to do. It is a huge liability, no question about it. We need alternative sources of revenue, no question about it. And we cannot solve it on the backs of residential property owners, no question about that. What we need is some breathing room. We need to come up with the alternative sources of revenue, which we have identified, govern and grow our way out of this. Bill's talked about the 3 million population. Whatever that number is, we need to grow the economy. We need to grow our city. We need people to move into the city, not move away.
So when you say breathing room, I assume you're alluding to the idea that we would borrow $10 billion?
No, not under the current arrangement. If we had the full faith and credit of the United States, or possibly what Illinois' lending borrowing rate would be, I don't know. But given the facts that are out there right now, no, that's the $10 billion.
Amara Enyia, what's your view?
This conversation has to happen against the broader context of what's happening in the labor movement nationally. So we just had a Supreme Court decision that essentially weakened labor unions almost beyond repair. So I definitely do not support changing the Constitution. It does cut benefits for people who are promised those benefits. That is, in my view, an easy solution to skirt our responsibility. At the national level, we have labor unions that have been weakened. We also have this issue of wage stagnation and the erosion of worker rights. So these are all issues that are directly tied to having strong labor unions. And if we don't have that conversation with the quality of our workforce, the kinds of jobs that we are attracting, making sure that we don't have increasing income inequality, then all we will do is change the Constitution while workers fall further and further behind. And it's also important to note that these public sector jobs were the way that many people got into the middle class, our teachers, our police, our firefighters. So if we're cutting the Constitution, we are essentially eroding the middle class that the city needs to have some revenue to support our finances.
You know, I have to tell you, this is a conversation. We're the editorial board. We have opinions, and we find it really hard to figure out where the money's going to come from if we don't also do something with the benefits. Mr. McCarthy,
let me just want to correct something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because you change the Constitution doesn't mean you take benefits away. That has to be negotiated. Right. So just changing the Constitution does not reduce anyone's benefits. But to have that honest discussion and negotiation cannot be done unless you change the equation here.
But the benefits have already been taken away, Bill. And I'm not disagreeing, but let's just get to the point here. I think I'm the only person here who has a pension. And I agree with Jerry that the obligation is on government, and they did not fulfill their obligation. And that's just not okay. And just take it a step further. Not only are the pensions in jeopardy, but we've already pulled the health benefits rug out from underneath the retirees. Simply unconscionable. So there's ways to come up with this money, and we can detail it up front just to get it started. There's a number of things that we could do because to come up with that $300 million that we're going to need in 2020, right? Is it
Right.
right? There's a number of things that we could do, but we have to be serious about this, and we have to fulfill our obligation. We need compassion, by the way, and I want you to just think about this. I said this a long time ago. What's been happening on the southwest border is akin to what's been happening in this city, because we're pulling health benefits from people who have stage 4 cancer. And at the same time, we're closing schools and pulling social services and mental health services from the neighborhoods that need them the most. We have an obligation as a government to have compassion for our citizens, and we don't have it here.
Yeah, we also have to pay for these. So, Mr. Wilson, number one is, what's your take on restructuring the Constitution? Secondly, if you don't do that, where would you find the money?
Well, I'm from leaving it as it is. Except for the simple fact is that when they started to work, they got certain benefit, and the city of Chicago owe them that what they have coming, right? The other question is how do you raise the money to take and pay for all this? Well, if you continue to raise taxes, you're gonna run more people out of the city. Continue to raise taxes, you're gonna run businesses to a more friendly state like Indiana, Arkansas, Texas, I think Tennessee. But if you lower taxes, you have more business comes into the city that create more jobs and create more of a tax revenue, right? So, but if you continue to raise it, we're not going to ever get out of that situation, all right? From a business perspective, we lower prices that people can afford to come and buy a product.
So what do you do in the next year? Because that seems like a long-term solution.
Tom, I can tell you numbers right now. I can tell you numbers right now. I laid this out for the that other periodical here, and it didn't get any light. First of all, we've got to stop political spending. We need incentive clauses for contractors to get things done on time and on budget. But the first thing we need to do, that we can do, is a 1-year freeze on new TIF spending, which, if we get $660 million like we did last year out of our TIF funds, that could give us somewhere between $200 and $250 million. The next thing that we could do is payment in lieu of taxes for all nonprofits, which could generate up to $50 million. We could do a parking ticket amnesty, which last time got us between $10 and $20 million. But the other thing that we need to really put on the table and talk about is getting our money back from the state, right? Over 5 years, that could be $100 million, our fair share of our sales taxes. But we really need to talk about annexation. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's a political football. It's legal. And we've lost population, right? I can tell you how we could scoop up almost 160,000 people in a heartbeat because our composite tax rate is lower than some of the college jurisdictions around us, like Schiller Park and so on. Annexation will give us the ability to combine municipal services, which will be cost savings, at the same time expand our tax base, and the incentive for them is, I could name like 6 or 7 jurisdictions like Norridge, Schiller Park, Oak Park, Evergreen Park, and Oaklawn that have higher composite taxes than we pay
I
here.
got to ask you, is this an issue that you've been bringing up before? Because it sounds pretty new to me.
I've mentioned it exactly once.
Okay.
And somebody said, no,
And
you
I
can't
think the
do
last
that.
time we annexed anything in Chicago was about 1893, about the time of the World's Fair. Is that correct?
I think it was later than that.
So
Well,
that's
no,
a really
you might be
interesting
right.
idea.
It was brought up years ago, but
Well, let's ask John, a couple of things. One is, if they don't change the Constitution, where do you think the money is going to come? Is Ms. McCarthy right? Is that a good idea? And secondly, since he brought it up, I think this annexation idea is really fascinating. What do you think?
Well, before you say something, I had the floor. All right. Gary
I'm sorry,
jumped
Willie.
in, all right?
I'm sorry, Willie.
All right. I think that if we're going to come down the road, everybody should have the same equal opportunity, right?
No, you have to be assertive, sir.
Well, yeah, but the
Willie's
look,
pretty assertive.
but if we're gonna do it fairly,
You have the floor now.
I want to make a point, because if I don't make the point now, later on it happens the same way. All right. So what I want to just say was that I had the floor and I was making a point. All right. I was making a point by you have to lower taxes. All right, in order to bring more business in. All right. At that point, then it went to someone else. Jerry, you're all right with me now, okay?
I'm all good.
Point,
I'm
right?
sorry, Willie.
All
I
right?
apologize.
No problem. So I just wanted to finish my point, was that raising taxes run business out of the city of Chicago,
Right.
right? You cannot make ends meet that way, all right? Then now my conversation ended. I just want to make that clear and wanted to be respected in terms of each party. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to say, am I the only one in this entire room that is upset on the way we got here today? So the reason why we're in this financial deficit is because of the Daley family. If I am a city worker or a retiree, I should be upset because they gambled away my pension for years. And now my generation, we can no longer get a pension because of all the gambling that went on, where the city workers were paying their fair share. And then you had the politicians who just simply mismanaged it. And I don't think, and actually I'm going to assert that the people who got us in this mess are not going to be the ones that get us out of it. And the Daleys are not the solution because they are simply the problem. I have the solution of, if you're a new employee, meaning you've never worked for the city of Chicago in your life, you have to go on a 401k plan. We are simply at that time where we can't keep adding people to this crisis. If you are a current employee or retired, you are grandfathered into your pension because they've been paying it and they've been doing their fair share. The other thing is we have to negotiate. We have to negotiate moving forward. A lot of people are simply not negotiators. They just listen what the unions say and go from there. We have to challenge people. And the unions have been doing a great job. They've been challenging the politicians and they've been winning the whole time. We have to stand and stick up for the people of Chicago. We haven't been doing that for the last 30 years.
The question was about the structure, whether or not the Constitution should be changed to allow for the change in benefits. I think it's safe to say that there are negotiations that have already been happening about different options on the table. What happens is once you open up the door of changing the Constitution to reduce benefits, it takes that good faith away from the conversation because workers have not seen adequate controls put in place to monitor the way the city spends its current funds to ensure that they will not misspend the funds that should have been going into the pensions. So you have to have those conversations as well. We can't go straight to changing the Constitution to reduce benefits. And moreover, on the labor side, we have to have a really serious conversation about how unions will be restructuring themselves so that they do not disappear over the years. And that includes, from a business perspective, talking about different modes of ownership and different modes of organizing businesses across the city of Chicago. The city can actually lead on that issue.
Super
Thank you
fast
very
question.
much.
Hey,
Before-
Mary, super fast question. Who does have a government pension besides Gary? Bill, do you have a pension? You know, so Gary, you're the only one. Would you forego your pension if you were elected mayor?
Forego my pension.
Yeah.
It's the only means that I have to support myself right now. My wife is supporting me.
Oh, but if you were elected mayor and drawing a city salary?
I don't know. Maybe
Okay.
not. My ex-wife has half of everything right now, so my finances are a mess.
Okay, fair enough. Go
I
ahead,
don't want to commit to
So
that
before-
publicly right now.
Before we move on to the next question, I wanted to give Mr. Daley an opportunity to respond to whether or not, the Daleys are responsible for the mess, quote, that we are in. What's your response to that?
Look, there's no doubt that no mayor, no governor, no city council, no legislature has solved the pension problem. Okay? It was exacerbated by the 2008 economic crisis and then the change in the legislature by the legislature in the ramp up in 2011, which the former mayor predicted would cause the largest tax increase in the history of Chicago, and it did. So everybody's guilty. If you want to look backwards, you can go back to Byrne, Washington, Sawyer, whoever, whatever. And every governor, every mayor, as I said, every legislature, every city council, they're all guilty. So what? we are talking about the next 4 years or the next 8 years,
It's
not
not
the
so.
last 40 years.
It's not so. People are struggling now because of mistakes that were made. The Dailies were the ones. They had their family members gamble us away. Why are we letting our family members dictate where pensions are going? Isn't that a conflict of interest? Is it all of a sudden we are not sticking up for what's right for Chicago? And that's the issue that we face in this election. We've seen many news articles with corruption. That's a part of the corruption.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to another subject, and I'm gonna give you, Mr. Wilson, a chance to answer this question first. We know that you're a successful businessman, and you've also been very, very generous. You're known for going out and giving money to the homeless and giving money to people who are in need, and that's a great thing. But in Chicago, one of the biggest problems Chicago faces is that they have we're basically two different cities. We have neighborhoods that are doing well and have infrastructure and have retail and have housing and all of that. And then we have neighborhoods that are lacking in basic needs, like a grocery store or, a sit-down restaurant or a place just where kids can go and play and feel safe. What would be your specific plan to change that picture? What would you do to bring investment to the South Side neighborhoods and the West Side neighborhoods that's lacking?
Well, first I'll make sure that equality and contracted job reflect all 77 communities without leaving out the inner city, all right? South Side, West Side, Englewood, Lindale, right? What happened right now, the dollars comes in, but they don't reach those communities. They reach downtown, right? They reach in the wealthy community. So we left all that out. You got to make sure that a law is passed, that making sure that every dollar comes in, taxpayer dollars come in, reflect its community as related to job, contract, et cetera, right? If the federal government dollars comes in, you must make sure they get the sheriff's dollars to those communities as well. Now, if you put $1 billion into some of the neighborhood, we don't have an infrastructure there or trades in order to be able to do the job. So we have to create grant, training program, working with the union, working with major corporations to put a tax break that these young men and young ladies can get a trade and they can get the job. Then they begin to bid on a job from the city. They can have X amount of dollars that comes out, let's say $8.5 billion over here. Well, it should be included to reflect all 77 communities, all right? But none of that would happen there. We must make sure that we're cut into the pie in Chicago, economically wise, job wise, as well as the business that we get tax breaks for international as well, and hook it up with training programs, schools, and things of that nature.
Anyone else have a different view?
Sure. So there are a number of things that the city has to do differently. One is the city's stated philosophy in the Department of Planning years ago was to intentionally invest more so in the central business district with the hope that it would trickle out to the neighborhoods. Clearly, that policy has failed. So the first step is that the Department of Planning has to have a policy of direct investment on the south and west sides. Private investment follows the lead of the public sector. So if our mayor and our leadership is not directing private investment to those neighborhoods, the private sector will not follow. So first, we need that philosophy change. Second, we have to have creative economic development tools. The current tools that the city uses only perpetuate inequity. One example is the special service area tool, which assesses an additional tax on businesses along a commercial corridor.
You don't agree with that?
I think that it does not catalyze development, particularly in challenged neighborhoods on the south and west side. So you can assess perhaps an additional $10 million in revenue on a corridor in West Loop. On a corridor of the same size and scope in Austin, you can generate maybe $150,000. That revenue is supposed to be used for beautification, for improvements, for many things, but on that economically challenged corridor, you can probably hire a security guard. Yet the city uses these tools as though the communities are equal across the board. We have to be much more imaginative. We also have to use a clustered model of development. This means on these challenged corridors, we actually have to create incentives through waivers of taxes, waivers of fees, and even incentives for rent abatements for entrepreneurs to locate as a cluster in these corridors, because no one wants to be the only business in a commercial strip. So they have to do that together so that it increases foot traffic, which is necessary to support small businesses.
Where has this worked? what's an example of where this has worked?
It's
These
worked.
ideas.
It's worked in other. So there's a group called Mainstream. They work across the country, and they take corridors and use this approach to spur development, to bring attraction, and to bring foot traffic. So the city could use that here. The other thing is the city-generated programs are problematic because they don't address the problem of lack of access to capital, especially for entrepreneurs who do not have a lot of money. So the reimbursable model assumes that you have $50,000 up front to make capital improvements or hire additional staff. If the business owner had that up front, they would spend the money. They don't. So the city actually has to create its own fund where it fronts the upfront capital to entrepreneurs so they can make the improvements. And that's an investment that we get a return on when the business is thriving.
So has that worked in Austin?
So we have taken that approach. We have identified on Chicago Avenue between Cicero and Austin a corridor where we're creating those incentives, where we're trying to direct foot traffic. But again, the city's programs do not support the development work that we're doing.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that?
Can I?
Mary's question was about downtown versus neighborhoods, right? Does anybody have a different philosophy about whether or not the criticism of Rahm Emanuel right now is that he focuses too much on downtown. Some people say it's just a philosophy that says you have to build up the engine of the city and then the neighborhoods, as you said, Mara, will benefit from that. Other folks think it's real cynical. They think the powers that be are just trying to make the rich richer. I'm really curious to know
We can do both.
if the rest of you folks think about that strategy. Is a river walk a really cool thing, or is it a symbol of how we've forgotten about the neighborhoods?
We can do
Garry?
both. We can walk and chew gum. We can hold on to downtown, keep that development going. But it starts with using TIF funds according to the way that they are designed to be used, not for places like Navy Pier or Block 37. That's simply not okay. But here's part of our plan. We want to work with the unions, put their apprenticeships right into the school systems. Whether it's middle school or high school, we could make that decision moving down the road. We got to bring back vocational schools to teach people to fish, not give them a fish. At the same time, what we do is we give small businesses and startups tax incentives to go to those neighborhoods to employ this newly created workforce. At the same time, we assume or pay for those $1 properties that we're selling all across the city, rehab them, and create affordable housing all at the same time. These are all interrelated. The economic stimulus comes all at the same time by creating the workforce, giving the tax incentives, and using the TIF funding all at the same time.
And just one example of
We
how
could do that
have
without losing Michigan Avenue.
And
I'm
one
sorry.
example, no, you're fine. One example of how we've not done that is the hospitality and tourism industry has been one of the highest performing in the city of Chicago in recent years. Yet when people come to Chicago, they're looking for an experience. We have not leveraged the neighborhoods and the rich cultures in different neighborhoods across the city as a tourism attraction tool, which would actually help small business owners, entrepreneurs, people who are living in neighborhoods, whether it's in Little Village or up on Devon Avenue or in Bronzeville, where the rich cultural experience of Chicago that we know can actually bolster our performance as a tourism destination for around the world. That's just one way to show how we don't have to take away from downtown, but our lack of investment and recognizing the value of the assets in the neighborhood is what has held us back.
In fairness, though, the mayor did create the Share the Wealth Fund that's generated tens of millions of dollars for the neighborhoods. What's wrong with that? Want to take a crack at it, Bill?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think there's a question on the transparency, how he goes about deciding, or the mayor's office decides where to put that money. But I think the concept of basically the successful developers downtown, landowners downtown are contributing to a fund that then gets spread out. Obviously, that we would all like to see that fund substantially higher. Back to your question, Tom, of sort of, I do agree that we can have it both. We do take great pride that the fact that not only downtown, but that it is spread. It's spread south, west, going north, this economic boom, how to get it further out in the city. Our headquarters is at Ashland and Lake, right off Lake. And, that's a thriving, booming area. You go 2 miles to the west, our headquarters sits in an area that's an economic opportunity zone. I mean, to me, that's kind of crazy.
But the
Okay.
Share the Wealth
But-
Fund actually is a reimbursable model, again, problematic, because for the businesses or whomever would take advantage, they had to have the money up front, which is part of the problem. They don't have the money up front. So it needs to be restructured. And secondly, there was, as Bill said, no transparency in terms of how the decisions were made, who would get the funds. And when I looked into this, because I do this work, we found that many businesses who benefited across the board got the funds, whereas new entrepreneurs that could stand to gain and expand did not get access to it. So the transparency is also a key that makes it not as effective as it could be.
What I was going to say is, obviously the focus has to be more into our neighborhoods. We've lost over the last 40 years about 400,000 African Americans from the city. Basically, Chicago was the envy of middle-class Black in America until the early 80s. Why did it change? Quite frankly, it wasn't until the early 80s that African Americans could move to the suburbs, most of the suburbs. Okay, and when they had the opportunity and finally the right, they did what lots of other people were doing because the jobs were out there. The Walgreens, the Sears, the McDonald's, and so many other employers. So much of the Black middle class moved to the suburbs, American Dream, two-car garage, all of that stuff. Now those companies are coming back into the city. Our big challenge is how to bring back probably the children or grandchildren of those families who left from neighborhoods throughout the South Side, less so the West Side. That's been 50 years since that really changed. And that's our big challenge, how to get and reach out to the younger people who are going to Atlanta or Austin or Denver or other places to come back here.
Yeah, I want to jump in and ask about something that has to do with development. And it's been a big controversy, Lincoln Yards. Everybody in this group has said pretty much they want some kind of TIF reform. If you were mayor, would you do something to halt that? Since there's such controversy over it, what would you do about Lincoln Yards if you became mayor?
I think,
Go ahead.
I think the Lincoln Yards and the South Loop TIF as evidence of the neighborhoods being neglected and the focus on the downtown. We're talking about building new neighborhoods. We're spending $1.5 billion public dollars in good times to enrich a development and developers that don't necessarily need that. How do we arrive at the 800 or 900 million for Lincoln Yards? What is the process in that? Could it be 700 million? Could 200 million go elsewhere? Could that be diverted or utilized better out in the neighborhoods on the South Side, on the West Side? I think that it's definitely been neglecting neighborhoods over the past number of years.
It sounds like you would do something to put a pause on that.
I think that TIFs should be used as they were intended to either prevent blight from happening or in blighted areas, and that they should also be used at.
Okay. Let's hear what the rest of you have to say. Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, let me just say this here. I see life a little different here from a business perspective. I think if you're going to get growth in a neighborhood that is depressed, don't have job, don't have contract, anything like that, I think to solve the biggest problem of this city would be case one. Let's just use CTA. A lot of the African American drive the bus in CTA. Okay? Why not put a training program within CTA? For example, who CTA buying the gasoline for? All right? Put a training program there, open up some business, put grant. Here's another part. Who make the tires of CTA?
Okay. With all due respect, the word I'm asking specifically about Lincoln Yards, because I want to know what people have to say about it.
Okay. Look, in other words, I think the priorities should be a little different. All right? Lincoln Yard, I think the priorities have got to focus on the community that's not taking then getting its fair share.
Okay.
All right?
All right.
Yeah. So the biggest issue is that people are leaving because they've been ignored. So if you look downtown, so many cranes are going up, and that's where all the money was funneled in. The TIF funds all went to the center, and that was a decision made. So I would not invest more money on the north side when it comes to TIF funds with the Lincoln Yards. It makes no sense. We have to start using them on the south side, the southeast side, and the west side.
All right, that's fair. That's direct and fair.
Anybody here who thinks spending TIF money on Lincoln Yards is a good idea?
Yeah, that's probably a quicker way to ask.
But also
Exactly. Yes or no?
Clarifying how the TIF is used. So the city has been very creative in porting TIFs from contiguous TIFs. You can port from contiguous TIFs, but we've always only done it one way. For example, the latest that happened with Navy Pier. We have not had a conversation about what it means to port TIF dollars from a wealthier TIF to underperforming or more poor neighborhoods through contiguous TIFs. That's a conversation that needs to happen at the city level with the Department of Planning and with the mayor. And secondly, it's not just the TIFs that's being used for Lincoln Yards, which I think it was being ramrodded through and should be halted. It's the fact that this will hurt the businesses and the industries also in that community. College venue, cottage venues that are performance venues, all of those things will also be hurt with the development project that's going on now.
So
Okay.
that sounds like a good idea, but at the same time, we are seeing retailers like, Target and, stores on the south side closing and moving out. How are you gonna, if the developers want to put something on the north side, how do you get them to change their mind? Forget about the TIF for a moment. Okay, they're getting incentives. How are you going to get them to decide they're going to put it on the west side? They're going to put it in, South Shore. They're going to put it in Roseland. There's plenty of empty corridors on the south side, and no one can figure out or will say what can be done to make sure that those areas are built up. What would you do then? How would you use your position as mayor to make sure that happens?
It starts with an overall investment in that neighborhood. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about philosophically. Mary, look, each one of our problems in this city are so interrelated, we can't separate them. Between gun violence, taxes, the economy, the education system, affordable housing, they all have to be solved. We have to show people that those neighborhoods will become vibrant and successful. And until we do that, we can't expect anything to change.
There's also the concept of linked development. So this, again, is where the city has to lead by example to send a strong message to the private sector. With linked development, you can have a project that might have started off as one development, but then you break it up into two. And you can have one, say, on the west side, one downtown, one on the south side, one downtown. These are things that are negotiated with developers. But it requires the city to lead on the issue. And the other thing is that when we have these development projects, the reason why a lot of times we get taken by surprise when a target leaves is because there's no early warning system in place when we got the target or whatever big box to locate in an area. So as part of the development, especially if they're getting public tax dollars, we have to require them to early warn the mayor, the department, so that they can start to plan with the businesses in the area so that they're not scrambling when a corporate decision 2,000 miles away results in a store being closed.
And
Okay,
overriding all that, I think the development.
quickly, and then we want to go on to another issue.
Okay,
Go
thank you.
ahead.
So,
Yeah,
thanks.
quickly.
Um, Public safety is a paramount for retailers and developers to go into any neighborhood. So we need to solve that problem in order to attract more investment out in neighborhoods. I think getting that under control, I think back to the Lincoln Yards quickly, my quarrel is with the amount. TIFs are great in bad times and good times. I don't know that they're necessary. So I just want to be on record on that.
Okay. I want to go to another issue which relates to public safety, and that's policing. And this question is for Mr. McCarthy. You've been the most critical, skeptical of the consent decree that the federal judge recently approved. Why is that? What is it that everyone else who's more enthusiastic about it doesn't get that you see?
Well, who was the police policy expert who participated in structuring that? Because that's critical. It didn't happen. It was basically an agreement between politicians and activists. That's first of all. Second of all, I have a big problem with the fact that what we're doing is we're taking supervisors away from supervising, and we're going to be putting them in administrative positions to document behaviors. In other words, they're not going to be on the street supervising what the police officers are doing. That's a recipe for disaster. At the same time, New Orleans is $55 million into getting out of their consent decree. And why is that? It's because the monitor is the person who decides whether or not you're in substantial compliance, which means they don't get paid anymore. So it's really hard to get out of a consent decree because these people are taking away their own salaries. But at the end of the day, my question is, is this now the standard for policing in the state of Illinois? Because you can't hold one department to one standard and everybody else to a different one.
Well, yeah, but the Chicago Police Department is the one where the Justice Department came in and said, this is what you need. So it doesn't apply to other districts. It applies to Chicago, where.
So we need some truth telling here. And back in January of 2017, that other periodical sat me down in front of their editorial board, and we did a 10-point rebuttal to what the problems were with the actual DOJ report. And at the end of the day, a fact that nobody seems to want to hear is that CPD's use of force, according to the Justice report, is on par with the rest of the country. So I think the emotion around this takes away the practical nature of having the right conversations. Consent decrees, let me just finish this, please. I'm sorry. Consent decrees, and I've read 28 of them. Consent decrees can be a very good thing. This one was shabbily done. That's the bottom line.
That's my question. Let's understand the history. So, as I think most of us understand here, the police shooting of Laquan McDonald left a city in crisis. Mm-hmm. The city hall's handling of the Laquan McDonald shooting led to your being fired. That led to the Justice Department report. That has led to the consent decree. And I know you've always felt, and tell me if I'm wrong with my wording, that you were scapegoated, that your dismissal was simply a political act and it was unfair. And I wonder if the consent decree is a continuation in your mind of the idea that you and the police department have been scapegoated for the larger problems of Chicago.
I think to a degree, there's a lot of validity in what you just said. As far as my personal opinion on my scapegoating or not, whatever you want to call it, which I don't think I've ever said publicly that I was thrown under the bus. Other people use that term all the time. But police chiefs get hired to get fired. It's like being a football coach. We know that. And when we're stuck in a political morass like we have here in Chicago, it took me about 2 weeks to figure out when I got here that I was holding a tiger by the tail and that this could happen at any moment. As a matter of fact, my wife told me over and over again, she said, Garry, this is not going to end well. And the revisionist history that's been written around this really needs to be straightened out because the same exact conditions exist today. Eddie Johnson is not in charge of the discipline system of the Chicago Police Department, yet he's accountable for the behavior of every single police officer there.
Right. That's what a police superintendent is supposed to be. You're responsible.
But you're responsible, but you need authority.
So you're saying Eddie Johnson doesn't have authority?
He cannot fire a police officer. Do you know that? The police board disagreed with my recommendations to terminate people 75% of the time until Lori Lightfoot took over the police board. And at that point, those numbers started to come down. But authority and accountability have to go hand in hand. You can't be accountable and not have authority. This is a flawed business model.
Right, but beyond the Laquan McDonald tragedy, there have been many, many stories that came out about police brutality. This is the reality of Chicago. So it wasn't just, maybe the Laquan McDonald case brought it to the forefront and brought it to a head and brought on the consent decree. Can you even acknowledge that there's something had to be done about what was going on within the Chicago Police Department and the policing and communities of color?
So, Mary, police chiefs have about 20 minutes to turn a department around when they walk through the door. That's really the truth. And during my tenure, and please let's go back and check this, complaints against officers went down while arrests and crime also went down. So, business management of policing is how places like New York and Los Angeles are being as successful as they are. We implemented that stuff and we were having a lot of progress. It wasn't victory. And I can't change what happened with John Burge, right? That happened long before I got here. And guess what? I can't change 300 years of history and the prism through which African Americans look at what happens on the street today. But this is why I talk about this all the time. We have to have this conversation. We have to have truth telling. We need to sit down, look each other in the eye, stop hollering at each other, and let's figure out how to move forward and stop the polarization.
What the rest of you have to say.
Go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, I just want to hear what the rest of you have to say about the consent decree and
the
policing in general.
The problem that we face in Chicago right now is that there's too much tension between the police and the communities. So my specific plan to change that, because the police are doing a vastly great job. They have to walk into the work with a gun. Many of us don't have to do that. So it's a very difficult job. And the communities there's, like I said, there's that disconnect. So so my specific plan to reduce the tension is in order to police in that district, 60% of the police officers have to live in that district. So now they'll be seen as community members and not as outsiders. They're going to know the neighborhoods better. They're going to know the residents better. And the residents are then going to trust them. They're going to be growing their families there. Therefore, the natural is going to be they want to be safe. So now you have this tension that's going to be going down. And then that allows the cooperation between the communities and the police department.
Okay, and that sounds, I don't want to, well, how are you going to enforce
It's
that?
okay. You can say it's
How
a
are you
good
going
idea.
to enforce that? Because, yeah, people do want to know who their police are, and police should be familiar with the community. But how are you going to make police officers live in a particular district?
No. See, it's all so the only ordinance right now in the city of Chicago to police in Chicago is that you have to live in the city.
Right.
All you're doing is saying you do a grand map of where the police officers live currently, and you have them stay in their districts. Right now, you have a police officer who lives on the north side, policing on the south side. The resident is not going to feel that is a connection because they don't know the neighborhood as best.
Okay.
So and there's 25 districts in Chicago,
to
so
say
it's just
about that.
reallocating.
One of the key words in this entire discussion is legitimacy. The reason why the consent decree, though it may have flaws, is absolutely necessary is because you can't build trust if there's no sense of legitimacy within the department, meaning it was a necessary step for people to believe that the reforms that have been called for long before Laquan McDonald are actually put in place. In addition, it's the financial cost. We've just talked about the need for revenue, yet we're set to spend $1.7 billion just on police misconduct cases alone. That's a direct result, not just of the Laquan McDonald case, but years of refusal to implement the necessary reforms that would mitigate this issue in communities across the city. So the legitimacy is the first step to rebuilding trust. There are many things that the department can do, whether it's in how they recruit, where they recruit, how they train officers, that can address some of the existing tensions, but it's going to be much harder if there's no sense of legitimacy in the department. And secondly, looking at how we allocate a third of our budget to public safety. And when we talk about the most hardest hit communities in the city, we always talk about those communities through the lens of violence. So then the investments that we see in those communities are always in police infrastructure, whether it's a police training facility that's posed as economic development or bigger guns or additional cameras. When we know that on blocks, the residents in those blocks are the best eyes and ears to monitor those blocks. So the police department can actually institutionalize stronger block clubs in those most hard-hit communities. So instead of spending resources on additional bulletproof vests or whatever, we can actually strengthen block clubs so that they are the best frontline individuals who can work in tandem with the police to monitor their own communities without having to get only police investment in these neighborhoods where they need investments of every other kind.
Let me add something to that. Yes. The way I would do it with this, I would hire 4 superintendent of police to make sure we get the relationship together. 4 superintendent of police, divide the city in 4 sections. Integrate the cars of the police officer, making sure that the police officer get promoted fairly and equally, all right? If we communicate together, we began to learn one another's habit and what we do, and we began to understand that particular person, all right? And the police officer right now, the white, the black, the Latina, they got a problem within themselves right now themselves, even before they get to the community, right? So you have to straighten that out, right? Then we'll make sure that each superintendent of police make sure that the law is in place, that equality for job and contract would be in place, and I will hold them accountable for that.
I'd like to ask Bill this question and then the rest of you the opposite. Bill, why should we have a third Mayor Daley? And the rest of you, why shouldn't we?
Look, I think we need a first Bill Daley mayor. Okay, you can look back. I'm proud of my father. I'm proud of my brother. What they tried to do as mayor of Chicago. My career has been very different. I've not been a career politician. I've spent most of my time in the private sector, along with serving President Obama and President Clinton. So I'm proud of my record. I've laid out a pretty aggressive plan about reform in a whole host of areas to take some of the experience I learned in the business community and apply it. I don't necessarily think just because someone's been in business, that gives them a unique ability to govern, and as is being proven at the national level right now, and quite frankly, in many ways, the last governor. But I think the combination of that experience, along with being around government and politics my whole life, gives me a unique opportunity to lead this city.
Amara?
The people of Chicago are ready for a drastically different direction and a philosophy that has, by all accounts, not really served the entire city. We're here talking about the tale of two cities. We're here talking about the number of the hundreds of thousands of residents, not even just Black residents. The city is #1 in population loss over the last 3 years. That's saying something about where we're headed. We have a report that just came out that showed that 1 in 3 millennials do not see themselves having a future in the city. If you look at Black millennials, that number is even more stark. So we have a serious change in direction that's necessary, but it requires a different kind of leadership with a different philosophy that actually values equity in terms of allocation of resources.
It sounds like you're thinking that Bill Daley is just a continuation of the same sort of policies and perspective of his father and brother.
Well, we've had one.
Because he says he's not. I mean, he says he's his own guy.
That's fine. I mean, and he has every right to present his argument. What I'm talking about is what the people of Chicago have said in my being around the city and having conversations in neighborhoods across the city. What they're looking for is a clean break from the status quo and anything that is tied to the past. We've had 23 years of one mayor. We had a brief interlude, then we had 22 years of another. And what we have today is, again, 3 years in a row of population loss, stark inequities, and the people saying that they want a drastically different direction.
Garry McCarthy?
So I agree with everything that Amara just said, but I want to kind of steer it in a different direction. And this is not about Bill. I have incredible respect for him, his father, and his brother. The bottom line in my book is, where was everybody in August? If everybody has all these skill sets, and if everybody is so passionate about fixing Chicago, why did it take Rahm Emanuel dropping out before all of a sudden people came back from the past? I don't get it. So that's my biggest issue. I'm sorry, but I see that as an automatic qualifier because I don't think it's being done for the right reasons. It's being done for a personal reason rather than for public service.
Well, they jumped into the race.
Joyce, your dad made a lot of money off Richard M. Daley. Why not another Mayor Daley?
My dad's not running for office here for him. I don't believe a third term for anybody. I'm for term limits. And I was there with you, Gary, back in August when this election campaign kicked off. And I would like to go back to the public safety issue that we were talking about before.
Wait, I wanted to ask you about a third Mayor Daley. Why should
Chicago
not have a third Mayor Daley?
Oh, I think it's time to move on. I think that between the public safety and trying new methods there, between the finances and kicking the can down the road, there's really no more road left. So we don't need any more can kickers. So I think for a lot of reasons, it's time to move on and bring fresh ideas and new energy to the job. And one of those fresh ideas is what I was talking about, was a neighborhood immersion beat program. Everyone was talking about the importance of getting the police officers in the communities a better relationship and building that. And what we have proposed is something that will get to the heart of that, will be true community policing. Right now, they got 279 beats throughout the city. We wanted to start out in 30 of those and have teams of 10 beat officers and 1 sergeant. Teams that will stay together for an extended period of time. We're proposing 30 months. Will allow team building, not only on the police department end, but also in the community. There will be familiarity. Those officers will have time to get in there and learn who the players are, who the good residents are, what the problems are, what problems can be addressed by a phone call or a visit, what do need apprehension and arrest. Crime clearance rates will go up because people will have more confidence that who they're dealing with, and that crimes may be solved, so they won't be afraid to come forward. Right now, why should they come forward with what's going on right now, given the atrocious clearance rates we have out there for violent crime? And that will be a cycle that continues and will make our public safety issue much better than it is.
John?
If Chicago wants to talk about the same 3 issues in the year 2023 of crime, education, and city finances as those problems, then they should elect Bill Daley, because nothing is going to change. And I'm sorry, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again. and expect a different result. You're not going to get a different result with the Daleys. That's just plain and simple. They're all part of the same network. That is just $1 million daily. I had personally had enough because my generation is the ones that are facing the results of the dailies. And they might be good people, but they're just bad politicians. They don't know how to stick up for the average person. They continue to put their families and friends first and Chicago in second.
Okay.
And I am tired of that.
Okay. Rick Daley got elected 6 times by the people in this city. Okay. And they voted for him. Now you can insult them and think they were all idiots because they voted for him. And that's basically what you're hearing here. And I'm sick and tired of hearing people talk about the people of this city who voted for somebody 6 times as though they're all idiots for doing that.
They voted for him because you guys continue to give out jobs. And therefore that network was created of voting for their boss. That's the truth.
Well, also, there is also an apathy and a cynicism that's set in over the last years. I mean, voter turnout in the last election was 30%. That number has never been high. And when you talk to people across the city, it's because they don't believe that things can change. They don't believe that their vote will matter. So that's something we have to take into account. It's not just that people voted, it's how many people voted, how many people even believe in government that change is possible. And this is probably the first time that people are seeing a glimmer of hope, which is probably also why there's so many candidates that are running for mayor.
That's a good sign too. It is a good sign that so many people care about the city to run and have different perspectives.
It might be irrelevant, but I don't think that this is cool.
Yeah, well,
we're not here to pick on Bill Daley. We should be talking about policies.
I'm a big kid, and I appreciate it, Gary. But to be mayor, you get picked on. Trust me.
Just being in public, we get picked on. We know
you'll get picked on. We'll all get picked on.
All right, listen, I'll tell you what.
Especially by Fran.
Dr. Wilson on this one question. Should we have a third Mayor Daley? And then we'll move to another topic.
Well, put it this way. Bill acted all right with me, okay? But the problem is that the son do not take on his father's sin. Everybody has to be accountable for themselves.
All right, thank you. So this is a question from Ms. Enyia. Recent news stories show that you've had a lot of personal finance problems, underreporting income taxes, being sued over rent and student loans. Why should Chicagoans trust you with a budget of nearly $9 billion?
Sure. So like most Chicagoans, I've had personal financial troubles. I happen to have gone to school. I've done everything that I was supposed to do, like many people in my generation. I don't know a person who's gone to school that does not have student loans or student loan debt. And in fact, we are struggling largely because we have not created an economy for where many individuals who are positioned like myself can plug in. But those personal financial hardships do not determine values and judgments. And like any responsible person, once the oversights on my part were discovered, we set about to correcting them. That's what you do. When a mistake is made, you own it and you set about to correcting it.
But you say oversight, and I think sloppy.
Everyone has made a mistake at some point. What's important is how you address it. With filing taxes, especially in a gig economy where it's different, people are piecemealing their careers together. They have many different sources of income. It's not as simple as it was 20 years ago when people stayed in one job for 30 years and then got a pension. That's just the reality. And we also have to understand that people will make mistakes. But again, a responsible person owns it and sets about to correcting it. Not just now, but this was already in place. Secondly, we've had mayors who've had stellar personal financials, but have had bad values. We are still on the brink of financial ruin as a city with mayors who've had stellar personal taxes and personal financials. So you cannot draw a direct parallel between struggling with personal financials and competence to manage a city's budget. That is just a false equivalency.
Mr. Daley, does hardship or sloppiness, whatever you call it, disqualify somebody from being mayor?
No, not at all.
Mr. McCarthy?
If it's a yes or no question, I'm going to say no, because you can hire the right person. Look, as mayor, I'm not going to have a spreadsheet and I'm not doing decimal points, right? I'm going to make sure that I'm surrounded by people who, A, think differently than me, B, have different skill sets that are going to serve the administration. So, you know, if Amara had trouble with the finances, we get a financial expert. How's that sound? You can still manage as a mayor.
Mr. Joyce?
I agree with Gary. It's about values and temperament and judgment. I don't think any mayor sits up there with a calculator trying to figure out how to balance the budget. You hire good people, great people that are skilled in that and have
Mr. Kozlar?
I would surround myself with the best and brightest, and just because you might have had financial difficulties doesn't just. I think in having financial difficulties makes you more of a real person, because you then know exactly how to manage your money, because a lot of us might not have a lot of money, and we're gonna be spending the individuals who are working hard in the city of Chicago. So I would surround myself with the best and brightest and check my ego at the door.
Mr. Wilson?
Well, I'm going to be mayor of the city of Chicago, so there won't be a need for it.
Got it.
All of you have talked about casino gambling, recreational marijuana as sources of revenue, but those are going to take a while. Chicago needs new revenue. Let's go down the line. What is one new source of revenue that Chicago should consider? Bill?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm not going to raise any property taxes, at least the first year. And I think we can find we need more money from the state. We have to get the share we used to get. Now that we have a total Democratic controlled Springfield, we should get more of the revenue that we have sent. It was cut back a few years ago.
How about a new source under your control?
I've laid out all sorts of sources of income, but you're absolutely right. Whether it's a real estate transfer tax, whether the possibility of a commuter, casinos, marijuana, all those will take time. So we've got to address the 2020 budget. But back to the original question, there is no way the math works if you do not take a look at trying to find a way to negotiate and address the big elephant in the room, and that is the anchor around our long-term economic future.
Amara,
I had
new
a
source of
quick
revenue?
question. He said he would not raise property taxes, but now he just said,
No.
at least not for the first year.
Well, actually, that's what he's been said all
Is it-
along.
Tom,
His
I-
question
so is it
here
all
to us
4
in
years or
December-
just not
John,
this
his
year?
question here to us in December, he made that distinction that
Thanks,
he would
Tom.
not raise property taxes the first year.
Just the first year. Okay, I just want to make
Wait,
sure that's clear.
wait.
Left open the possibility in future years, and I think in your questionnaire, you tied it to reducing the costs of government at the
Right.
same time.
And I said if we have to raise it after the first year, there'll be $1 of cuts for every $1 tax increase. I've been saying that from the very beginning, and maybe some people should listen to
Amara,
when
new
people
source of
speak.
revenue
I don't
under
believe
your
what you're saying.
control as mayor of Chicago.
Yeah, so there are a number that I have talked about. We've talked about clawing back dollars that the city does not go aggressively after for undervalued properties in the downtown area. I have talked about really assessing our redevelopment agreements to make sure that public tax dollars that have not been used, we haven't gotten our end of the bargain, are actually clawed back. We've looked at how we reform the TIF program to make sure that we're appropriately leveraging the dollars from TIFs. Also, the real estate transfer tax is a source of revenue, but committing it to some of the high need things that we've talked about as city mental health resources, addressing the issues of homelessness. I do not support a casino because I don't think that it would generate the kind of revenue that the city needs. However, I do support small businesses who want to have video gaming in their businesses because it actually increases their revenue and their profits for their own operations, which helps their bottom line. More importantly, I think that the city has to do a number of things to restructure our economy to make sure that we're on solid financial footing into the future. One, I think the city must have its own bank. I think a public bank is a necessary foundation to not only address the hundreds of millions and really billions that we spend now just in private financial institutions, but also we have to fund our own infrastructure. Everything from our water mains to our streets, roads, and bridges. We have to be able to assume higher risk by issuing low interest loans to small business owners so that we can expand that sector and create more revenue, home loans. Even with the marijuana industry, it's a cash industry right now. We can actually be at the forefront of that with our own bank. This is a foundational component that we have to have. And secondly, we have to reassess the property tax system. Right now, it is not consonant with the direction of the global economy. Brick and mortar stores are no longer the go-tos, and yet we're assessing property taxes based on an old model. The warehousing model where people are purchasing online is actually the way things are going across the world. And if we don't get up to speed on that, we're not even going to capture the revenue that we could capture from property taxes.
You know, Ms. McCarthy, to Fran's question about where's the revenue coming from, would you even leave the door open a little bit for property tax anytime in your first 4 years?
In my first 4 years, maybe. But I can promise, like Bill.
Because when I read your questionnaire, it sounds like you simply flat out reject any idea of a property tax
I don't think
increase.
that, first of all, I just got my property tax bill, and it's up enormously from last year again, which was 40% over 2015. We can't keep going like this. That's just got to stop. So that's got to be the goal. But if you want to find new sources of revenue, I'm going to give you 3. First of all, we have to stop the gun violence. Nobody has ever discussed the economy of gun violence. Okay? Okay, well, I have too. Second of all, we have to end the corruption and we have to end the nepotism because the economy and the efficiency of government stinks. Nothing gets managed. Until it gets managed, nothing's going to get done. And those are three sources right there that will find money for us. And I got one more. If you want to stimulate the economy, let's give back the money to people who it was stolen from when the assessor wrongfully assessed values on properties. We've got 31% of that money because 31% of our money, our property taxes went to TIF funding. Let's give it back to people. And you know what? They're going to go out and buy a G.I. Joe, which is going to help stimulate the economy.
I have a question I'd like to address to Mr. Kozlar. One of the debates in the criminal justice system is the recurrent of arrests of people who have committed gun crimes and the argument that they should be getting stiffer sentences to prevent gun crime. Can you tell us what your position is on that and compare it with the other people sitting at this table?
Right. So if somebody has an illegal gun on the street, I think we should have a strict penalty against them because they are the ones who are terrorizing our neighborhoods. There are people in my community who are on the south side who simply don't feel safe. And that's because a lot of these gangbangers are getting away with a slap on the wrist if they are caught with an illegal gun. I think it's a misdemeanor in Illinois. That's wrong. There should be some kind of a sentence going on to deter people from carrying guns. But the biggest gateway is to showing them that there are jobs out there that we're going to be investing in their communities. So we have to step back in the sense of we can't keep allowing criminals to get away with crimes. There was an officer that was killed last year. He was killed by a 4-time felon. Why was that 4-time felon on the street?
What about the argument that when you find someone with that illegal gun, it might be somebody who says, I'm just afraid on the street. I haven't committed a crime.
Okay,
I haven't done anything.
All right, then my counter argument to that is, well, what if they then use that illegal gun to shoot a 3-year-old?
It's an excuse. We're
Exactly.
accepting excuses.
Yeah, I don't want that gun to then be used to kill a child a week later. I'd rather have that criminal go behind bars.
Okay, you look like you've been
If you buy in the argument that certain people should have a gun out of fear that you just laid out, you have bought into the NRA argument that everybody ought to have a gun. Okay, now I believe if you look at the New York law, which makes possession of a gun illegally a felon, take Plexico Burress wins the Super Bowl 8 years ago. He goes in a nightclub, gun falls out of his pocket, shoots himself in the leg, and he ruins his football career. But he also goes to jail. I was with Mike Bloomberg. I said, he's really not going to go to jail, is he, with all the lawyers and money he has? Yes, he will. Okay. Now, we have to make sure that what happened with the drug situation, because the communities of color will say, you're going to put all our kids in jail, and those kids of yours aren't going to go to jail. And we have to make sure that for the first offense, if somebody goes to jail, a young person, that we make sure that kid doesn't fall into that trap. And then after that one offense is stuck in the system. Okay. So we have to help that young person when they come out. But until we send a message that having a gun is a serious crime, then we're just kidding each other. Okay. You have more guns. 1 in 10 guns is sold by a gun shop in the suburbs. All the guns that come from Indiana, because you could go there and buy a bazooka. So this has gotten crazy. Now, you're not going to solve it. And I agree with all of us who say that it's a very complex. We've got to get jobs. We've got to change the economy. But we also have to send a message that and as a country, we're nuts on guns. But this idea that we will excuse certain people or certain communities to have a gun is just buying into the NRA argument. And I think it's outrageous.
Can I just say one thing to that? Because there's a second
component. Can we hear
component.
from Amara on that, please?
Yeah, so if we don't, as a city, address the root causes of violence, that's when we're kidding ourselves, and that's what we haven't done. We have not addressed the public health hazards that create biological indicators for impulsive behavior, which leads to violent interactions in communities. We have not invested in mental health services. In fact, we've divested from those services in schools and communities, which also contributes to violence violent behavior. We have not provided the kind of economy where people can plug in. These are the actual root causes of violence, and they don't have that much to do with policing. In fact, if we address those issues, we make the job of police easier. Now, the research that's been done over the last several years has shown that the length of the sentence is not a strong deterrent for any individual that has the mentality to get a gun to kill someone. So whether it's 4 years or 7 years, that is not at the forefront of their decision making. So again, as a city, what we haven't done is address the root causes of violence, meaning all of these public policy areas. And until we do that with intention, we can have the strongest gun laws on the books, but we will still have people dying from shootings.
Can I just add, please? The second component that happened in New York that people don't realize was the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws. And I personally, everybody seems surprised when I say this, believe that we need to end the war on narcotics, which has been a wholesale failure in this country. Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and we haven't moved forward since then. So we have to focus on who needs to be in jail. That is proper criminal justice reform. Low-level narcotics possession is a social problem. Putting somebody who is a heroin user in jail is not going to change their behavior. Putting somebody who carries a gun in jail will change their behavior, because in New York, when we did those two things at the state level, incarceration rates went down, murders went down, and gun arrests went down all at the same time.
Look, I think you have to focus on this here. Guns don't kill people. People kill people with guns. And as a result of that is that people got financial, economic hardship problem. Other communities do not have it. The crime is not as high. The minority don't make the guns, but they get arrested. The people who make the gun and bring them in don't get arrested. So something is wrong with that whole scenario.
The police contract has been basically punted by Mayor Emanuel. There's really no negotiations going on. The next mayor will inherit this. And you have a union that has fought the consent decree tooth and nail. What changes would you make in the police contract, and how will you bring this union to the table?
Look, I'm not going to sit here and go through the contract to tell you that's for negotiations, and any good negotiator doesn't show their hand. There's no doubt the consent decree is going to happen. The police department, the police officers, the men and women of the police force will have to live within the consent decree and with a monitor. Many of the points Garry pointed out are honest observations about consent decrees. But if you take LA, which went much longer than they ever thought, whether it was for the reasons Garry laid out or other reasons, they have come out of that, and they have 4 million people, and their crime situation, and not that different of a city of ours, is much, much lower. And so I'm not going to sit here and go through a negotiation, but I think the police department, I think the police union will accept that they'll have a mayor who wants to be fair to them and live within the difficulties of our financial situation. At the same time, be very supportive, because I do believe the men and women of the police department.
I'm talking about changes in the disciplinary procedure.
I will lay those out as we negotiate, and I'm not going to do it here.
Garry McCarthy?
Well, I mentioned before, and I didn't get to finish it, that in 2012, I pointed out to the mayor that we had the most dysfunctional disciplinary system in the country. And what we needed to do was bring in some folks, create a blue ribbon panel of experts to pour through the fact that the police superintendent is not in charge of the discipline system. The police superintendent is not in charge of investigations into use of force, and the whole myriad of ways that discipline gets meted out, which are defined in many cases by state law right now. So changing the contract might not even affect anything, because state law defines a lot of these issues. That was rejected, and I asked that you go back and take a look at the SAFER report, which turned into a big pile of nothing. As a matter of fact, just to be clear, the issues of addressing what I wanted to have addressed were summed up in one sentence in the SAFER report, where it said changes to this system would not be able to go forward because of political considerations in Chicago.
I think it's important to note that out of the last couple of years, when these conversations were really at the forefront, there were some recommendations that were set forth by community groups that addressed, as Garry mentioned, there's some state law issues with regard to how long records are kept on officers. People want to know the backgrounds of the officers in their communities. If they've had long disciplinary histories of being problematic in communities, that's information that actually helps in decision-making, whether those officers should still be on the force. Another thing that was at issue was the time after an incident for which police officers have about 24 hours to what's considered to put their stories together, and whether or not that's in the best interest of avoiding things like collusion, which we saw in the case of the 3 officers that were just acquitted a couple of weeks ago. So there are some specific things that have risen to the forefront, but we have to have a mayor who is willing to negotiate in good faith and to negotiate in the best interest of the public, of the residents of the city, because again, our failure to do so costs us not just morally with the lack of legitimacy that's perceived with the department, but also financially with the billions of dollars that we're paying in police misconduct.
All right, I'm going to play a management role. We're at 15 minutes left in the ball game here. So we're going to try to hit 2 topics, education and immigration. So let's start with schools. So I know in the afternoon panel, we've got both Gary Chico and Paul Vallis, who took over the education system together in 1995. I'm just interested in knowing, and anybody can jump in on this, are our schools, did they set our schools on the right track, or did we get off track, fall deeper into debt? What's the status of our education system now, and where does it need to go?
I believe we fell off track by going away from the neighborhood school system model. There was dissatisfaction, obviously, with that. That's what caused the rise in the charter schools and the magnets and the selective enrollments, which in many cases have been very positive impacts and alternatives for parents and children. But as a result, the neighborhood schools have suffered. So now we have a system, a hodgepodge system that works for so many, and for so many, it doesn't work. And there are so many wonderful neighborhood schools, but there's a lot of underperforming neighborhood schools. So my goal would be to resource neighborhood schools, bring those back, show an appreciation for the understanding that neighborhood schools are not only places of learning, but they're also anchors in communities. I'm not talking about a moratorium on charters, but charters are supposed to be for alternative means of learning, new teaching approaches. So things like Waldorf, or I've discussed with some educators on the far south side, starting a charter. They want to start a charter for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade female STEM students. I think that's great for charters. I also think charters should also have to have administrative pay that is commensurate with CPS teachers. And teachers in charters should also have residency requirements the way CPS teachers do.
I want to say this too.
To Chris's question, do you give a grade to Chico and Vallis for their performance in running the public schools when they were here doing that?
And Bill's brother, to a certain degree, right?
And Rich Daley.
No, I'm not going to give a grade. It's different times, different circumstances. They seem to grade themselves pretty highly all the time, so I'll leave that be.
Bill Daley, what's your take on that?
On what?
On the grade you would give Gary Chico
It's
and Paul
25 years,
Vallis
almost 25 years ago. The city was different. The economy was different.
Yes, but what happened then brought us here.
No,
the
yes.
question, Mr.
But as you know, that first of all, it was 25 years ago. Yeah. Just take the pension issue. The step levels were increased in 11, fundamentally changed the money that was needed in that time when the budgets were balanced. Both people have spoken of their service, and I think both of them did a good job, started us on a course to where the system has improved, but they were able to use pension money at the time to balance the budget. Okay. But that's a long time ago. Our real challenge right now is, and I've laid out a couple of things that I think are very different. One is we should go from the local school council system to a neighborhood school council. So you'd have maybe 50 neighborhood school councils that would look at the neighborhood and say, what do we need in our neighborhood? As opposed to just fighting for one school.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh. Instead of fighting for one school, you'd be concerned about the whole neighborhood. What do we need in the neighborhood? Right now, 75% of the kids in school, high schools, go outside their neighborhood to another school. Half of grammar school kids go outside. Why? Because the parents want to find a better school. So I think if we set up 50 to 60 neighborhood school councils with 8 to 12 schools, the neighborhood could then decide, what do we need in here? And our goal ought to be at least multiple level 1 schools. But we don't have, first of all, we also have 153,000 empty seats in our school system. It was set up for a different city. And no one predicts that over the next foreseeable number of years that we're going to have that number of kids in our system. So we have to get real about the system.
Okay, just quickly, the pension thing, that does affect us now. I mean,
Absolutely.
using pension money back then does affect the system now.
Well,
But
not
to-
funding the pension system also. by
Well,
all
I mean,
the
it
governors and
affects
all the mayors.
the school
Right.
district's finances. But that was 25 years ago,
Right.
point taken. But you all are talking about neighborhood schools. But the point is, the district is strongly not a neighborhood school system now. I mean, to get back to where you're really talking about a neighborhood school system where most kids go to school in their neighborhood, you're going to talk about maybe, how are you going to accomplish that
Well, I
when the
think-
system is so strongly selective enrollment, charter, magnet? How do you
No,
do
but
that?
most of the school kids don't go to magnets or selective schools.
Well, but most kids go to a school outside their
yes,
neighborhood.
because their schools in their neighborhood aren't good enough for them, in their opinion.
And therein lies the problem.
Right.
There are structural things that CPS has to do if we are truly committed to the idea that every child, regardless of their neighborhood, has access to a good school. One is we have to change. I advocate for changing the student-based budgeting model. Right now, the funding follows the student, but because of population decline, it goes to the building. And when that building loses population, it loses its money. So we are actually pitting schools against each other who are now competing for a smaller and smaller share of funding.
Well, what do you say then to Mr. Daley's argument, which is really interesting? When we look at what we did with Closing 50 Schools, we looked at the individual schools. We didn't really look at the neighborhoods. And one of the impacts has been that we didn't understand that community schools are more than just schools, they're community anchors. And what I think Mr. Daley is saying that if we look at it as a neighborhood large issue, not one school, but all the schools within a neighborhood, we can diminish that impact on the social anchor aspect of closing school. But we could also, Amara, look at whether or not a particular school has to be closed or kept open within a little bit more of a logical interconnection with the other schools nearby.
Well, but it's important that the conversations around education don't focus solely on whether or not to close a school. I think one of the downsides to Chico's and Vallis's tenure is that there was this building boom of schools without forecasting the city's population. And so we have all of these schools, population decline. Now we have vacant schools and underutilized schools that need to be closed. And that's important to take into account. I talk about changing the student-based budgeting formula to an equity-weighted formula so that the resources follow the student. We know that students are coming out of these communities, some experiencing trauma, some from single-parent households. All of those things take into account what a child needs to learn. So the funding should follow the student. It has to be equity-weighted. Second, CPS needs an entire department of equity because we have to address how capital expenditures are made, where new buildings are being built and annexes. We also have to address the inequities in programmatic expenditures because right now on the west side of Chicago, we don't have IB programs. So if we're interested in making sure that in all of the neighborhood schools, they have the enrichment programs, we have to have an entire department to do that analysis. Third, the way that CPS currently draws its school boundaries perpetuates segregation in the city. We use these boundaries to create an entire new school boundary for white students in Dunning on the northwest side, while Steinmetz still has to suffer with the lack of investment in its schools. So again, a structural issue. And finally, if we are going to address access to a quality high school, the selective enrollment model needs to be reevaluated completely. It was done to keep middle-class families here so that they would have a school and would be comfortable. What we're seeing now is that parents don't want to have to struggle and fight to figure out as soon as their child is born where they're going to send their kid. So instead, they opt to move out of the suburbs. I argue that that's part of why we're experiencing this decline in population. That model has to be reevaluated.
Overarching all that, though, is we need a 10 and 20-year plan that looks at the demographics and the future of what the city's going to look like. So we don't get into the situation where we overbuilt so many schools and we have this undercapacity. But when I say neighborhood schools, I'm talking about having a viable option. I'm not talking about getting rid of all the good things that are there right now. Every neighborhood should have a viable option for it.
The neighborhood schools should be the baseline, and then everything builds from that.
And what's needed,
and
I don't
they
think
need to be hubs of the community, not just places where we send our kids.
Right.
I'm sorry,
No,
Jeff.
I think so. And we don't need neighborhood councils to let us know what we need to put in those schools. 50% of the classes of the first year of city colleges are remedial. So what we propose is a looping program for K through 3, where the same teacher stays with 8 to 10 to 6, whatever that number is, a small number of students to focus on reading comprehension. Because if we cannot graduate our kids from our city with an ability to read and comprehend what they're reading, we're doing them a huge disservice, and they have very little chance of success for the rest of their life.
All right, moving on to immigration. Immigrant advocacy groups have a problem with Chicago's sanctuary ordinance, or as it's officially called, the Welcoming City Ordinance. It allows police to turn over to immigration agents undocumented immigrants who have outstanding criminal warrants, leaving a question of due process. It allows police to turn over defendants in criminal cases. It allows police to turn over immigrants who have been identified as gang members in a gang database that is really shaky. And it allows police to turn over undocumented immigrants with felony convictions. Mr. Joyce, do you have a problem with any of that? They want all of those carve-outs eliminated, the immigrant advocacy groups. They've been trying to get the city to get rid of those. Where do you stand?
My stance is it's a federal issue and it should have been taken care of, but obviously it hasn't. So now we have to deal with an issue here, and we need to take into account compassion and understanding for all Chicagoans, and also the need for proper law enforcement. So as you alluded to, problems with the gang database, to the extent there are problems with that, I'm okay with that carve out.
With eliminating it or with keeping it?
No, with putting, we got our double negatives here. I'm okay with that exception being put on hold as an exception until we get the gang database straightened out. But I don't want to do anything that's going to impede criminal investigations or impede or lessen safety in our city.
Okay, so you see the gang database as a problem. Mr. Kozlar?
I believe the first people we need to deport are corrupt politicians. Then from there, I believe that Chicago should maintain its welcoming city status for people who are here who have no violent past. But if somebody is a felon in another country that wants to come here, I have an issue with that. I would then want to get them out of our city. Okay,
but if I'm undocumented and I am a defendant in a criminal case, should I be turned over to ICE? My case hasn't been adjudicated yet.
Right, it depends on if a violent crime is taking place. So if you, for instance, shot somebody in another country and then came here, I would not want you to be in Chicago. But if you're somebody who doesn't have a violent crime on your hands, or you're just somebody who just wants to have a good life in Chicago, I will not be aiding ICE with the CPD.
Ms. Enyia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're already going through the criminal justice process. I mean, I don't think that there should be a direct pipeline essentially going through that process when it hasn't been adjudicated to now getting into deportation status with ICE. I support eliminating the gang database also, just for a number of reasons, having to deal with transparency, having to deal with the lack of information about how you get on or can you get off of it. And also because there are instances where people have been harmed because they've been in a system, in a database. In one case that I know, it was mistaken identity, and yet this had huge implications for them later on down the line when it was discovered. So I actually do support eliminating the database. I support the removing the carve-outs in the welcoming ordinance, but also the city is not aggressive about going after employers that exploit undocumented and documented workers. So this is another thing about how you can be secure when you are living and working in the city. So as we talk about immigration as a whole, we also have to talk about how they are exploited in the workplace and what the city can do to mitigate that.
Let me just be clear, I do not support eliminating the gang database. I think that's a useful intelligence tool.
So just a couple of quick things. First of all, I'm a little disappointed that we haven't addressed the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is political corruption and what will we do to fix it. Yes. But the second thing, talking about immigration, being undocumented is not a crime. The police should not be reporting to ICE immigration status. If you get arrested for a felony, you need to be charged, prosecuted, and then deported if you're undocumented. We should be a welcoming city, just like we should be a welcoming country.
Mr. Daley and then Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, I'm in favor.
I'm sorry. One last thing. I'm sorry. Criminal intelligence should not be transparent. We have to draw the line somewhere. If there's problems with the gang database, we need to fix it, not throw it out.
Let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla then, the corruption scandal that's unfolding. How big is it going to get? What's the answer to it for you as mayor? Bill?
Sorry about that.
I don't know. I have no idea how big it's going to get. It's anybody's prediction. You all on that side of the room may have a better idea than the people on this side of the room. There's no doubt there must be change. That's why I've said we ought to fundamentally look at how we're structured as a government and fundamentally change how we view the aldermen who have been historically, way before anybody in this room was alive, were basically the mini mayors and all city services went through them. And you had a political structure that supported that. And that's been changed over many years. So I think it's time we ought to take a serious look at going to 15 members, making it more of a legislative body than a mini mayor sort of executive role, get away with the ability of aldermen to just veto anything, make it a full-time job, give them term limits, as I've said that the mayor should have, and change fundamentally how we view the role of aldermen. That's a serious change. We can go on the margins and have a new reform bill or executive order, and all those things are good to do, and most of us have laid those sort of things out to be either codified or by executive order as the mayor. But I think we ought to take a serious look at how we're fundamentally structured as a government.
So we're going to make this the last question. It's a great one to end on, and we're past our time. So let's go down. Dr. Wilson, what would you do about the corruption in the city council? And do you favor some sort of reduction of the size of the city council?
I really think you should, yes. I think you should go down something like 11 to 15 people.
What would be the advantage of that?
Well, you save money. You save, it'd be less corruption.
Because fewer people means?
Fewer people, you can manage it much better. Yeah. So I would be in favor of that. Then I get the rest of it, then I would open up an investigation on everybody now and make sure we can try to get rid of the corruption that exists today. Those things that I would take then take
What do you think? I mean, what Mr. Daley is saying is that if you reduce the size of the city council, it's a structural change that's so basic, it's the best way to go, as opposed to, these little things like letting the IG look at the city council.
Go ahead. Just one thing. I'm not saying that
they shouldn't do
guarantees honesty, okay? But it is a way to structurally change the way we have viewed aldermen and their function in the government.
Okay.
So I think they're two different things. The structure I agree with is way too big. Quite frankly, we got to really take a look at the organizational chart and how business gets done. But if you want to end the corruption, it starts with intolerance of aberrant behavior. And that's not what we have here in Chicago. We do everything with a wink and a nod. We call it the Chicago way. We have a name for it, right? And that takes leadership. That's how the cultural change is going to start. I can tell you this.
Can I just point out that we also have a code of silence in the police department, which is almost identical to the code of silence in the city council, and that you were the superintendent of police at that time?
Look, that's a great shot. That's a great shot, Tom. But you know what? You also have it in the media too. So let's get everybody involved. The doctors, the lawyers. Let's just get it all out there. Okay? The issue here we're talking about is corrupt politics in Chicago. And at the end of the day, it starts with intolerance of the conditions that we're living in. People expect to be lied to by elected officials here in Chicago. We're listening to people talk about the fact that aldermen should not have a second income, yet people are running for their second office at the same time. Talking out of both sides of our mouth, we shrug. My wife argues with me all the time. She says, Gary, it's never going to change. That's the mindset here. It's never going to change until somebody changes it, and it starts with leadership at the top.
I completely agree with that. And I also think that it's about institutionalizing corruption and not relying on the benevolence or the morals of those who are in office. So it is a serious matter to expand the reach of the Inspector General to be able to have the power to investigate aldermen. I think it is a product of removing many of these administrative functions out of the hands of aldermen and into executive offices within the mayor's office. So we did that recently with workers' compensation, but quite frankly, that should have happened years ago. And yet yet it was tacitly accepted in the Finance Committee under one person's control. That is the business as usual mentality that prevails in City Council. Having these institutional measures, making sure that to get assigned as a business owner, I don't have to get shaken down by an alderman. Those are things that address corruption. They actually address our economic situation as well, because many businesses leave on the basis of that alone. So we have to institutionalize it. I think you can have 15 corrupt politicians, or you could have 50 corrupt politicians. What matters is the processes that are put in place to institutionalize transparency, expand the reach of oversight bodies, and remove functions that should not be in the hands of the legislative branch back into the executive.
Okay, let's get answers from Jerry and John, and that'll call it a day. Jerry?
I am in favor in reducing the size of the city council, probably in half. We've had a 50 for so many years, and we have so many advances as far as technology goes, the internet and cell phones and iPods, and 311 has really thrived. So a lot of the functions that aldermen would do have been rolled into city agencies. So I think we would be fine by reducing it to 25. I don't know if that affects potential for corruption or not. Like I said earlier, term limits, I've been for that. Outside income, outside employment for an alderman. Alderman is a full-time job if you're doing it correctly. You're getting paid full-time salary, north of $100,000. So I don't think you should have outside income. Something that people have not been talking about. I believe that zoning matters should be logged, whether they be phone calls, meetings, conversations. Not necessarily what took place in those, but at least a record is kept of that. Anything that can make our government more transparent is going to generally be a good thing. So I think that would go a long way. But at the end of the day, you can't legislate away criminal behavior. So,
John, you get the final word.
I believe in a few things. One, I believe in term limits and no outside jobs by any elected official. But the biggest thing we have to understand is that there is a political corrupt network in Chicago. And the corrupt network, once you're in it, you do not get out of it. And that's why there are 4 candidates who are running for mayor of Chicago who are all a part of that corrupt network. And I am ashamed that there are some candidates who will call that corruption out in the newspapers, but they won't stand up against it in person. And that's tiresome, because I had enough as a citizen of Chicago opening up the front page and it being another corrupt scandal. In order for us to get away from the corruption, we need to elect somebody new who's not tied to it. We need to elect somebody with fresh ideas and doesn't owe their family and friends. We need to start putting Chicagoans first, and that's why I'm running for mayor.
Hey, thanks to all of you for coming in today. We're doing this again at 3 o'clock, so we hope you tune in. So, thanks a lot.